All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one like the other one. So check it out, you guys. This story right here, this is a long story. It's probably going to be a multiple part story. So without further ado, I'm going to get straight into it. There's a lot going on in this story. This is a story that I've been previewing for a couple of months. However, before I got into it, I wanted to make sure that I got all the information. There's a few things that I wanted to vet in this story that I had to follow up on. That's why it took me a little bit of time to put this story out. Anyways, without further ado, let me get straight into it. So this story is mainly about a federal racketeering conspiracy or a RICO investigation called Operation Keys to the City. My source, who I'm now going to refer to as Sporty, was one of those indicted in this operation. So I'm going to go into some of the intricate details that were conveyed by him. You know, this kind of goes without saying, but a lot of the things that I'm going to talk about in this story are coming from a first-hand account. So a lot of it goes well beyond what was reported in the media. But before I get into the story, let me just say this. Aside from the actual indictment and some of the pre and post activities that took place that are all relevant to this investigation, this story is also going to be based on Mauricio Mendez, Cyco from Paradise Hills, Richard Buchanan, Cheeks from Otay, and Jose Marquez, Bat from Del Sol. From there, I'm going to go into several incidents that took place in MCC, the Metropolitan Correctional Center in San Diego, between the Paisas and the Sureños, as well as how Cyco and Bat bumped heads in MCC. Then I'm going to take you guys into the federal BOP and tell you what ultimately happened to Cyco. I've also got exclusive pictures that go with this story. So if you're one of those types of individuals that only likes to check out the first 10 or 15 minutes of these videos, at least scroll through the story so that you can check out some of the pictures. So with respects to the Mexican Mafia leaders from the San Diego faction, I briefly touched on some of them in one of my recent stories that I did titled "The MA Offers Chapo Protection." You know, some people believe that the MA offering Chapo protection was nothing more than a political power grab, and that the MA's real objective was to secure vast amounts of clavo for its own monetary gain. That it was never really about protecting Chapo. It was all about streamlining large amounts of product from the Sinaloa cartel straight across the border into San Diego, and that Ronnie Ayala seen the potential in building off of that relationship. Others believed that it was a farce, that the Sinaloa cartel would have never have entertained such a frivolous and ridiculous proposition, based on the fact that Chapo didn't need protection. Protection from what? Protection from who? Himself? I mean, he was buried so deep within ADX's security parameters that you could theoretically say that they practically had him entombed somewhere under the prison. He virtually has no contact where he's at with anyone, and with a standing no human contact order that could be in effect for decades, Chapo doesn't need to be protected. But either way, my point is that this story highlighted most of the Mexican Mafia's leaders, or those members who have been a historical factor from the San Diego region. Just for the sake of this story, some of those that I'm referring to are Jose Marquez, Bat, Robert Romero, Dawa, Richard Martinez, Gato, Ronnie Ayala, Ronnie, Hector Ayala, Hector, Roy Rivas, Roy Boy, Raul Leon, Weddle Sherm, David Baron, Popeye, Luis Garcia, Boo Boo, Rudy Espudo, Crazy, Frank Madriaga, Chino, Martin Corona, Joe, Richard Buchanan, Cheeks, Mauricio Mendez, Cyco, and Angel Serrano, Chino. These are just a few to name, as these were some of the pioneers and architects from San Diego that would not only become leaders in their own right, but some of them would also become instrumental in doing something for the Mexican Mafia that had never been done before in that organization's history, establishing and building alliances with the Mexican cartels. You know, don't get me wrong, there's been other Mexican Mafia leaders from Los Angeles and other parts of Southern California that have also been instrumental in tapping into some of Mexico's resources. In fact, I talked about this in one of my past stories, where Evil from Chiques, Stroller from Tunerville, and Malo from West Side Locals were working out there. But with San Diego right there on the border, this is definitely giving them a lot more advantages. In regards to the geographical advantages, let me give you guys another example. In a region adjacent to the United States-Mexico border, for decades, San Diego has taken full advantage of the ease of border crossing to conduct business with Mexican D suppliers. And Sureño gangs within San Diego County have long provided a pool of talent for which the Mexican Mafia recruits solely for this purpose. But San Diego had the ability to take it to another level. Popeye practically had all of Logan Heights out there acting as enforcers for the cartels. Anyways, like I said in this other story, Bat is probably one of the most underrated Mexican Mafia members from the San Diego area. The doors that him and Popeye opened up when they were working as enforcers for the Felix Arellano cartel are still benefiting the Mexican Mafia to this day. And when you talk about guys like Bat, Popeye, and Martin Joe Corona, these guys achieved the rarefied lofty status of completing the elite gang trifecta. They started out as loyal sureños, then they put in work for the Mexican Mafia, and then they ultimately performed a laundry list of business executions on behalf of the Felix Arellano cartel. That's a resume that not too many members can claim. However, like all members of these criminal organizations that live and die by the sword, Bat was no different. On March 11, 2011, following a 4-day trial for using a contraband cell phone to traffic Chris from a prison cell, Bat was convicted in a federal court and sentenced to life in prison by a U.S. District Court judge. You know, later on in the story, when Bat would end up bumping heads with Cyco, it was actually during the time when he was being held in MCC to stand trial for the case that would end up putting him up on a shelf for life. I'll get into that part of the story later, but first, this story actually starts out sometime in the early 90s when Cyco from Paradise Hills was sentenced to the California prison system to serve out his first prison term. You know, my source didn't remember what he'd been convicted of, nor did he remember how much time he got. All he really remembered was that Cyco had eventually ended up in High Desert State Prison on one of its level 4 yards. So after Cyco hits the yard, apparently he put himself on the fast track for making a name for himself. And he did that by putting in work and frontlining conflict whenever it kicked off. So Sporty said that Cyco had been involved in several hits, but the one defining hit that got him recognized was when him and another Sureño from San Diego County stabbed a correctional officer on one of the 4 yards. So supposedly it was behind this CO being disrespectful to several Sureños on that yard, and according to Sporty, this CO went out of his way to make it personal by searching some of their cells and destroying some of their properties. He was doing things like purposely ripping up personal family pictures that were taped to the walls, stepping all over their bedding so that you could visibly see his shoe prints on their sheets. And then he'd also do shit like pouring out their shampoo, toothpaste, lotion, all their cosmetics mixed together in their sinks. Or he'd dump out some of their coffee on the floor and purposely bust open their soups or bags of chips that they got off the canteen. Unnecessary extra shit. You know, it might seem petty, but when you're in prison and it's all you got and most of your financial support comes from your family, it hits different. No, this is money that's coming from your family. It's money that they've worked hard for. So when something like this happens, it's easy to see how you can take it personal. So as a result, and I'm sure after much deliberation, this CO was targeted and Cyco raised his hand to be one of the 2 shooters that hit him. And according to my source Sporty, they hit this CO pretty bad, to the point to where he had to be taken to an outside hospital. You know, stabbing a CO is an extreme countermeasure that comes with obvious consequences. And usually this is only done as a last and final option when all other acts of diplomacy have failed. And I guess they felt like they reached that point. Because you guys got to remember, that kind of shit would be pressing the line for anyone, any one of the different group segments out there, regardless to how much you try to avoid from getting into it with them. That's taking disrespect to another level. And even though there's going to be some real blowback, meaning that they're going to come through tearing shit up, everyone's cell is going to get trashed after this CO gets hit, there just comes a point when you have no other choice or no other option to say, enough's enough. This is where we draw the line. But honestly, like I said, getting into personal conflicts with COs is something that's usually avoided, especially when you're talking about structured, disciplined groups like the Mexican Mafia, the Nuestra Familia, the Aryan Brotherhood, and the Black Guerrilla Family. Because this is a conflict that's going to end up creating more problems than anything else. But again, when your back's against the wall and you can't get around it, it's a countermeasure that sometimes you got to take. So Cyco ended up picking up a new case for stabbing this CO. And once the case was adjudicated, he was shipped off to Pelican Bay to serve a shoe term. Now, I'm not sure what happened after that. I don't know if they opened up a validation packet or what happened, but he ended up staying there in Pelican Bay for the next 6 or 7 years until he paroled. And keep in mind, this was sometime during the mid 90s, so everyone was still back there in the shoe at that time. At any rate, while he was back there, some of the Mexican Mafia's leadership took an interest in him. They recognized the fact that he had a lot of heart and that he wouldn't hesitate to put work in. That he basically had all the potential and the characteristics that they look for when scouting out new potential candidates. Keep in mind that during the 90s, the shoe in essence became the ideal environment for these criminal organizations that were on their recruiting campaigns. It became to be their fertile training and recruiting grounds. And what better league of candidates could you possibly select from than the ones that were back there for putting in work? The ones that had already proven that they were more than willing to spill blood. Once they were back there in that environment, it gave these criminal organizations an opportunity to evaluate their loyalties closer, and then to make a determination as to whether or not they possess the mindset or the mental abilities to make that type of lifetime commitment. Because let's face it, that lifestyle isn't for everybody. There's a lot of guys that express a willingness to be recruited, but this doesn't necessarily mean that it's always for the right reasons. That's why there's a weeding process, and at least for the NF, that's why there was a 90-day probationary period to determine whether or not they were making that commitment for the right reasons. So at some point, an older, longtime senior member of the Mexican Mafia named George Ruiz, Silent George from Logan Heights, took an interest in Cyco as well. He was the one that took the most interest in him, and he was also the one that would end up sticking his neck out there and raising his hand for him. Apparently, Silent George seen the untapped potential, enough so that he felt proportional enough to bring him into the fold and to raise his hand as his sponsor. So because Cyco was from San Diego, Big George was considered to be like one of his big homies. And that's how Cyco embraced Silent George as one of his big homies, somebody that he had a profound level of respect for. So according to Sporty, Silent George wasn't one of those old school types of Mexican Mafia members that had an inflated ego or who had a superiority complex. He was a laid back type of individual that presented himself like an open book. If you had a question about something or you wanted to learn about something in particular, he took the time out to nurture you and to educate you the way he was supposed to. On the other hand, he was another one of those Mexican Mafia members that had been around for years, but yet you seldomly heard anything about him. But this was by design, because he stayed out of the messy politics and he kept his head down. He wasn't power hungry and he wasn't position motivated. He rolled with the punches and fell in line where he was supposed to. But like I said, he was somebody that had attained a lot of respect and status over the years, and he was another well-respected household name from San Diego. So eventually, after Silent George's celly paroled, Cyco moved in with him, and this is where he would stay until himself would parole a few years later. And while they were celled up, this is obviously when Silent George was able to indoctrinate Cyco and spent a considerable amount of time giving him his CASHAPP. But aside from schooling him and lacing him up, Silent George had a long list of personal tasks that he wanted him to take care of for him as well. Some of the normal common things that anyone would want you to take care of if you were getting back out there yourself. Things like going to visit his family to see if they needed anything, doing welfare checks, taking some pictures, and then most importantly, once Cyco was established, Silent George wanted him to bring his daughter and his granddaughter up to Pelican Bay to visit him. Now, before I continue, let me just say this, because I think this is important for you guys to understand. Asking another brother to go visit your family when he gets out of prison obviously requires a lot of trust. Whether he's a Sureño, a Mexican Mafia member, there's certain things that come along with this that are expected that don't need to be said. Meaning, if I send someone to my family's house to do a welfare check or to take care of something personal, like bringing them up to visit, there's going to be certain expectations that I'm going to hold this individual to, and this is common sense. I would expect them to be respectful, to look out for their best interests, to do whatever he needs to do to take care of them. And then, of course, when it comes to the women, everyone knows that it would be considered a serious violation to get involved with them intimately on any level. And again, you would like to think that these things would be respected and that this brother would show your family a higher level of respect. Because after all, our families are supposed to be our sacred and purest reflections. Everyone knows this, but unfortunately, more often than not, you get individuals that might initially have good intentions by going over there and taking care of everything that they promise they take care of. But then later on, you end up finding out that this individual had an affair with your wife, your girl, or another female family member. You'd like to think that this individual wouldn't cross these lines and that he'd be smarter than that. But I'm telling you guys, it happens more often than you might think. I believe Silent George even told Cyco specifically to keep it professional when it came to his daughter, because he obviously knew she was an attractive young woman, and this was something he was concerned about. Anyway, with respects to Cyco, eventually he ends up paroling, and he takes care of everything Silent George asked him to take care of. He does a welfare check, he drops off flowers for some of the women, and then he even makes arrangements to bring up Silent George's daughter and his granddaughter to visit him in Pelican Bay. Again, he basically does everything he asked him to do. So as far as Silent George was concerned, Cyco proved that he was a stand-up type of guy, and that he also showed an exceptional level of good character for taking care of his family. And this is something that he righteously appreciated, because Cyco didn't have to do it. So Cyco, he earned high points for this, and this solidified the bond that he had with Silent George. However, later on, this would all change once Silent George found out the true extent of Cyco's involvement and the real interaction he had with Silent George's daughter. I'll come back to this later on in the story, but again, this is a subject and a topic that a lot of people don't like to talk about, especially those that are still in good standings. But there's a lot of brothers out there that are just dirty, and they can't be trusted around women. They can't be trusted around your family, and that's just the way it is. I myself went through a couple of bad experiences, and after that, I never sent anyone out there to do anything for my family ever again. So after Cyco gets out there and he gets his feet under him, he does all his grunt work, and he recruits a crew that starts working under him on the streets. They began moving large amounts of Chris, and this is where the bulk of their proceeds came from. Those first few months after you get out are critical. You either sink or you swim. And by all accounts, it looked like Cyco was doing everything right. He was breaking ground and he was generating money. But at one point, two Mexican nationals that they were working with, named Jesus Rodriguez, Chuy, and George Duenas, Blue, enlisted Cyco's help in recovering a $54,000 debt that was derived from a weed transaction that went sideways with Chuy's brother-in-law. Apparently, this guy shorted him $54,000 and promised to pay him back. But after getting the runaround and a number of stories from this guy, Chuy and Blue asked Cyco to help him recover this money. So Cyco, he only agreed after being promised to be given $10,000 of it. So on August 30th, 2008, Cyco, along with Chino and Muggsy, who were both members of Cyco's crew, drove out to Coronado, California in Chino's blue Mercedes-Benz where this guy lived. All three of them had handguns. Several other carloads of Cyco's crew also drove out there as backup, but initially none of them entered the house. So when they got to the residence, allegedly they encountered a female and her husband in the driveway that were getting ready to leave the house. The female actually ended up being the sister of the guy that they were looking for. So after herding these two back into the house, almost immediately after entering the house, they end up encountering the individual that they were looking for. So Cyco and Chino take this guy upstairs while Muggsy stayed downstairs and kept this guy's sister and her husband at gunpoint in the living room. So once they get this guy upstairs, Cyco demands that this guy give them the $54,000 that he owes Chuy, otherwise they're gonna shoot him in the kneecaps. This guy claims that he didn't take any money from Chuy, and he tries to convince Cyco that Chuy's lying to him. However, Cyco advised him that he didn't care about all that debt had now been turned over to them, and that one way or the other, they were gonna get that money. After pistol whipping this guy and trying to get the money out of him, at one point it became clear that he didn't have that kind of money in the house. So they ended up ransacking the house and taking several items that were of value. They took two new Dodge Ram trucks, a black Mercedes-Benz, $2,000 in cash, 2 laptop computers, 5 expensive watches, and miscellaneous jewelry. Once they finished loading everything up, they kidnapped this guy at gunpoint, and then they left the house. But before they left, they advised this guy's sister and her husband not to call the cops, and they warned them that if they did, her brother would die. Chino supposedly chambered around, pointed his gun at him, and told him, "You better not call the cops, or we'll be back. We are an army. There's a lot of us." According to the indictment, those were his words verbatim. So they end up taking this guy back to Chewy's house, where him and Blue, the two Mexican nationals that he owed the money to, confronted this guy about the money that he owed him. So after pistol whipping this guy and beating him for a period of time, they end up telling him that if he doesn't square up this debt, that they're going to kidnap his family and they're going to murk him. Then they end up letting this guy go and they give him a set deadline to pay the money back. So fast forward about a month later to September 16th, 2008. Cyco ends up getting arrested after he was pulled over in one of the two Dodge Ram trucks that was taken from the residence in Coronado, California. From there, he would eventually get caught up in this federal operation called Operation Keys to the City. And the crazy thing about it is that this investigation only spanned over the course of a year, and initially, Cyco wasn't even the main target. He fell into the trap later. He became the product of the investigation after a series of wiretaps, but the primary target in the investigation was Richard Buchanan, Cheeks from Otay. Cheeks had been under investigation for years, and he had been indicted several times during the 7 years he was incarcerated at the San Diego County Jail. He basically had his hands in everything at that time, and according to Sporty, he had San Diego on lock. This is why they came up with the name of the operation being Operation Keys to the City, because the inference was that Cheeks was running San Diego and that he was giving out keys to different neighborhoods, almost as if he had the status of some type of gang-inducted mayor. So let me try to summarize this for you guys. On January 5th, 2008, in another federal operation called Operation La Mano Negra, or the Black Hand, a correctional officer was actually among the 37 people that had got indicted in that operation. The prison guard, Jessica Chavez, who was assigned to Donovan State Prison in San Diego, was charged as a co-conspirator. So Jessica became the primary focus of the probe when one of the llaveros that was housed at the prison called Cheeks on a contraband cell phone. The purpose of the call was in regards to a co-conspiracy to assist Jessica in killing a parolee with whom she was having an affair with after he was released from Donovan State Prison. I'm not going to get into the reasons why they were going to take this guy out because I'm actually going to run that story sometime in the near future. So unbeknownst to this llavero that was locked up, Cheeks was the primary focus in a federal investigation by the San Diego Violent Crimes Task Force, and they had Cheeks' phone tapped. So this ended up being a bonus for the feds. And trust me, they start salivating when it comes to taking down a dirty cop. And Jessica, she had her hands in all kinds of shit. So during the course of the investigation, it was also discovered that Jessica was not only having an affair with this parolee, but she was also having an affair with this llavero that was still in custody. She was definitely spreading the love amongst the homies. That's a given. But she was obviously also about equal opportunity, and the feds didn't like this shit at all. So that was one investigation that Cheeks was under at that time. However, Cheeks was also under a second investigation and the primary focus of a suspected kidnapping that he was involved in with another guy named Steve Perez. Steve was an Emmett crew member who had accompanied Cheeks during the kidnapping, in which the victim was to be driven to a designated location and executed. However, an FBI surveillance team succeeded in interrupting the attempted murking and making an arrest after discovering a handgun. Fate was definitely with this guy that day, because if the cops wouldn't have found that gun, he was surely on his way to take a long dirt nap. So during the drive and prior to the stop, Jessica actually called Cheeks' phone and asked him to meet her for drinks after they were done. But unfortunately for her, she'd have to take a rain check on the drinks because Cheeks was arrested and this was the last time he'd ever see the streets. So basically from this point on, Cyco is now in custody at the San Diego County Jail on charges stemming from the stolen truck and the kidnapping. And this is when the internal politics started to become a factor. Meanwhile, the feds utilized this time to start building an airtight case against Cyco and his entire crew. At that time, nobody had been indicted yet. They just started bringing in members of his crew on various charges. One by one, they started trickling them in. And this is typical. It usually takes them about a year to put a case like this together and then to present it to a grand jury. But initially, none of the cases were consolidated. They hadn't even charged them with the conspiracy at that point. They were still building the case. I'm sure Cyco and his co-defendants knew it was coming, especially when they all started popping up in the San Diego County Jail. And you can kind of read between the lines the way that they start drafting up the police reports. Names start popping up in police reports that were never there before. And now it starts to look like everybody was working together in some big convoluted conspiracy. So according to Sporty, the feds even went to MCC and pulled Cyco out to see if they could spook him into flipping. Another tactic that the feds are known for. I guess they led Cyco to believe that he had an attorney visit, and then once he got out there, they introduced themselves and told him they just wanted to give him an opportunity to get out. Otherwise, he was gonna get buried with the rest of his homies. So Cyco, he apparently tells him that he's not interested and he starts to walk out. But before he leaves, they tell him again that he's in a lot of trouble and that he's gonna be going to prison for a long time. Obviously, this was a seed that they wanted to plant and they wanted it to resonate. So according to the indictment that would come later, the feds allegedly had evidence that Cyco and his crew were working together with the Arellano Felix cartel as far back as 2008. And the feds claimed that the Arellano Felix cartel was paying taxes to the Mexican Mafia by providing representatives of the organization with large amounts of product. So I guess in theory, the feds were claiming that they were paying taxes, but one could easily attribute this as payments made to the Mexican Mafia and its associates for acting as enforcers for the cartel. I'd be willing to bet that the Arellano Felix cartel wouldn't like or acknowledge any money being made to the Mexican Mafia described as tax money. At the same time, you also got to take into consideration that the feds like to use words like tax money and extortion for the purpose of trumping up their cases and using these kinds of descriptive words to give it a flavor of criminality. So as the feds continued to build this case, they also charged Cyco with the second kidnapping that they alleged took place on September 11, 2008, 5 days before the first incident in Coronado. They claimed that the second kidnapped victim was a pregnant female who had violated the Mexican Mafia's rules. So in several phone calls that the feds intercepted of wiretaps of Cyco and several of his crew members talking, this is how 90% of this case was figured out. It's crazy when you think about it, but again, 90% of the case was put together based off of information that they heard in their phone calls. So from listening to Cyco's wiretaps, the feds determined that this female was kidnapped, assaulted, and extorted. And according to Cyco, this was for improperly using his name and the Mexican Mafia's name to garner proceeds that belonged to the Mexican Mafia. This is called name dropping, something that she technically could have been murked for. But name dropping was the least part of it. Stealing is something that usually results in an automatic death sentence. But according to other wiretaps and confidential information that was gathered from several confidential informants, this female victim was originally kidnapped by Arcadio Nieto, Muggsy, who was also a member of Cyco's street crew. So once she was kidnapped, she was then driven to a predestined location where Cyco was apparently waiting. And when Cyco got his hands on her, he allegedly choked her until she lost consciousness. Then after reviving her, he warned her never to use his name to facilitate her activities ever again, otherwise she would be murked. Furthermore, he advised her that she now owed money to the Mexican Mafia for using his name and the organization's name to swindle people out of tax money. Muggsy allegedly then hit her in the head with a pair of hair clippers that he had brought with him. And then after hitting her, he used the clippers to cut off most of her hair, or as it was described, that he cut off half of her hair. But what's even more concerning is that all this was done to her while she was pregnant. I don't know if Cyco and Muggsy knew this at the time, but once it got physical, I'd be willing to bet that she probably said something. So the next incident in the indictment involved a foiled kidnapping and an attempted murking by several members of Cyco's crew. And again, all these crimes were articulated in wiretapped conversations between Cyco and his crew. They talked about it on the phone every time they did something. And there's no question about the fact that they made the Fed's job a lot easier. And they did a lot of the work for them. I think this is one of the main reasons why this case was expedited as fast as it was. You got to remember, it only took a year from the time this investigation started until the time they dropped the hammer on him. So on September 15, 2008, Cyco and his crew attempted to kidnap another individual on behalf of the two Mexican nationals that they were working with in Mexico. The kidnapped victim was allegedly kidnapped by 3 members of Cyco's crew at a McDonald's in San Diego. So while this individual was in the parking lot getting ready to leave, he was approached by Chino, who asked him for directions. So as he was giving Chino verbal directions, Muggsy and another one of Cyco's crew members named Ruben Gonzalez approached this guy's car with guns and ordered him to get out. After they made him get out of his car, they then told him to get in his back seat. Chino then sat next to him and Muggsy sat on the opposite side of him so that he was sitting in the middle. Ruben then got in the driver's seat and drove. And all 3 of these guys had handguns. So at that point, the victim was told to keep his head down and that if he tried anything stupid, he'd be shot. So Ruben, he drives to a location in Chula Vista where Sykes is waiting in one of the Dodge Ram trucks that had previously been taken in Coronado. I don't know why he continued to drive that truck, because it was hot and I'm sure they had a bolo out for it. But this is something that would end up catching up to him later. So the plan was to transfer this guy to the truck and then to leave his car behind. But as they were attempting to transfer this guy from his car to the truck, he broke free and took off running. So as this guy's running, Chino, he apparently fires a shot at him, but he misses. When he attempts to shoot at him again, he claimed that the gun jammed. And as a result, this guy, he ends up getting away. And after this happens, you guys already know what's gonna happen next. They intercept more wiretaps where they articulate everything that just happened. The feds listened to these wiretaps between Cyco and Muggsy, and Cyco basically recounted the whole incident. Cyco basically says that Muggsy attempted to shoot this individual, but after getting off one shot, his gun jammed and this guy ended up getting away. In that same phone call, Cyco talked about how they were going to take this individual to Mexico and turn him over to their business contacts. He said they were going to try to get as much money out of this individual as they possibly could before they surrendered him. But as it turned out, they dropped the ball and they didn't get anything. However, later, after the victim called the cops, the investigators went back to the scene of the shooting and were able to recover a .40 caliber shell casing along with the victim's vehicle. Cyco and his crew still weren't arrested at that point, but the case was gaining fast traction. So from there, the indictment alludes to several locations where Cyco and his crew allegedly sold large amounts of Chris. Anyways, I hope you guys have enjoyed this episode of Paradigm Profiles. If you guys enjoyed this episode, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't like this episode, give it a thumbs down. But either way, drop a comment and let me know what you think. As always, I want to thank those of you who continue to show your unwavering support and for just continuing to tap into the channel. With that said, you guys enjoy your week and keep pushing that positivity. Until the next one, this is your boy B, and I'm gone.